say it's purely on open innovation and innovation management. But having worked in the procurement, public procurement sector for some years, I developed personal, independent researches in public procurement and sustainable procurement. So this is one of the outcome of some of those researches that I've done, and I'm interested in inputs from the floor on how I can improve this paper, probably submitting it for a publication in journals. So today I'll be discussing, this concept under social responsible procurement, and I'll give an overview of what social responsible procurement is all about, then move to why does it occur? I mean, what's the rationale for it? Why do public organizations will integrate social factors? And I think from the previous speakers, we've heard from, moving from neoliberalism to sustainable procurement, and we've also had a situation where we think the public sector should focus on the impact that their spends make on the community rather than looking at cutting costs. So I will also talk about what are the focus and the strategies involved in implementing social public procurement. Then go into my main study, which is a case study of what happens in Nigeria, and justify the study and talk about the methodology that I've used for this study. Then give some snapshot on the results, discuss that, and make some implication for future government policies. And I have to say here that the motivation for this research was the fact that I realized majority of public sector research, especially in public procurement, are based on doctrinal studies. So sometimes I see, articles that they say there is sustainable public procurement in Germany, and the evidence is just to go to the public procurement policy and cut out an article from there as an evidence that public sustainable procurement is being implemented. But now this is an academic environment, and I think we need some scientific and empirical evidence for us to show that this really happens. So what I decided to do is to look at Nigeria and go to the tenders and see if we really have evidence of that. So what is the concept of social responsible procurement? There are different, definitions, and some people call it sustainable procurement, which is a generic term that involves incorporation of social factors, environmental factors, and economic factors. You have responsible procurement, purchasing, social responsibility. So, I mean, what is in the name? You can call it whatever you like, but what is important is it's actually driving the impact of public spend on the well-being of the community. So, so why does it occur? Why would organizations integrate social factors into their procurement policies? And I have to tell you this, that the emergence of corporate social responsibility in the private sector has led a lot of private sector organizations to consider social factors in their procurement process. For example, to improve social performance in their supply chain. And of course, some of us are acquainted with the issue of gap, where the competitor of gap says Gap employs underage people, either in China to do some job, and that impact on their brand in the supply chain. So for them to address that, they look at how do we ensure that we respond to the impact of our procurement exercise on the community, the impact on well-being, so that that does not affect our brand overall. So social responsible procurement has been established a lot in the private sector from the perspective of corporate social responsibility. However, in the public sector, a lot of public sector organizations, a lot of governments try to respond to the global challenge of sustainable development, and which came up in the Rio de Janeiro conference in 1992. And of course, it was interesting to see that after the Rio de Janeiro Conference of Sustainable Development, a lot of countries come together and decided to use public procurement as a tool to promote sustainable development commitments. However, before the Rio conference, social responsible procurement has been in existence. it might not be called social responsible procurement or sustainable procurement, but then Mark Crodin gave us evidence that procurement linkages has been in existence even before 1992, where the public sector tried to intervene into the market as a buyer and as well try to regulate the market to ensure that there is equity and equality amongst the players. So the market traditionally is played by the concept of liberalism and competition. However, the government could see some failures in the market. An example of such failure is when small and medium enterprises don't have the capability to compete with big organizations. So the government as a buyer can decide to intervene into that market and create some conditions that will support those disadvantaged groups. However, what is important is the legal framework must not be contravened in that process. So it shouldn't favor party A at the expense of the next party. So connecting social responsible procurement to sustainable development. Coming from the concept of sustainable development is beyond the generic definition, just like you have here, that meeting the needs of the present without compromising that of the future. It has gone further to actually categorize what are these impacts that we want to measure. And over time, it has been, subdivided into 3 different pillars, which we know we call sustainable development pillars: the economic, prosperity, social, and environmental protection. So in a sense, social responsible procurement falls under the social justice aspect of sustainable development framework. Now, from the literature, there are evidence that the use of public procurement to achieve sustainable development goals actually start with the implementation of green procurement, which is considering environmental factors in public procurement processes. And from there, the consideration of social factors has been a bit neglected, all right? And that is from the perspective of sustainable development. However, when you talk about procurement linkages, the social factors have been considered even before the emergence of sustainable development. So, what are the key areas of focus, when you're looking at social responsible procurement? One of the areas that you look at from the literature is diversified supply base. You have a blend of different suppliers, small suppliers, big suppliers. The third sector, you have different groups making your supply base, and that could generate innovation as well, because you have entrepreneurs as well who can give you new product. Employment and training. How do you use public procurement spend, which is huge, to drive skill? How do you ensure that the suppliers and bidders try as much as possible to influence skill and development? Some of the focus is also on what we call social benefit providers. And I think the UK government is emphasizing through the localism law to ensure that we have a lot of third sector, NGOs, social enterprise integrated into the public sector. Also, how do you ensure that public procurement framework is used to ensure fair trade and labor standard? I mean, it doesn't make sense for you to give millions of pounds to a supplier that would discriminate amongst his employees. Also, community development, infrastructure project, for example. How do you ensure that a construction project, generates local employment? So these are some of the focus that needs to be considered, or that have been considered in social responsible procurement. However, how do you implement this? First and foremost, it could start from the specification stage of procurement by designing what we want. Now, we want to procure a machine that will construct, bridge, for example. What is the impact of that on the community? And you begin to identify the social impact of this project. And from that, you can integrate that into the specification and say that from this procurement exercise, we want to make sure that this spend is going to affect social lives. You can also set aside, because these are the areas, these are how government have deployed social responsible procurement, by setting aside some percentage of contract. We see that a lot in SMEs, where we say 20% of the total expenditure of the government goes to a certain, set of group of suppliers. And you want to award the contract, then the contract will be awarded to that organization that is able to generate more employment in the local society. And how do you measure that? From the proposal, you've asked them that they should give you evidence of the number of new jobs that are going to create and to tell you how they are going to create those jobs. And you can use that to actually measure, what impact they're going to make on employment. However, what happens after the contract has been awarded, it's another story which is outside the context of my presentation. Because in most cases, such generation of jobs and employment are not measured, and it ends up there. Offering back. This is quite interesting. In some situations, you have a small and medium enterprise that have bidded with another organization, but you realize that the bigger organization is giving you much value for money. But when we talk about social responsible procurement, we are moving from value for money to value for many. Okay, so you try to call back that small supplier and say, can you reproduce your proposal? Can you match up with this price? However, when you look at that as well, how does that impact on competition? What is the legal environment for that? I mean, these are outside the context of my research. There are issues of argument at the moment. Contract design as well. You can try and split up the contract into lots so that it will attract small organization. And general assistance. And that's one of the things that this institute is doing. The One in the Tender project is providing support for small and medium enterprises in the locality to empower them to make sure that their capacity to bid in the public sector is enhanced. So it's one of the ways of, deploying social responsible procurement. And these are some of the examples. The EU law gives obligations relating to employment protection and working conditions in public procurement. For those of us who have worked in public procurement environment, you realize that when you're planning a tender, you look at the issue of TUPE. Is it TUPE? Yeah, I think it's TUPE, yeah. Yeah, transfer of employment undertaking and that, So that's one of the things that you consider. You want a situation where the people, the employee of the existing contractor will not be rendered useless after the contract has expired. Also, we see that in the United States, some portion of the contract, there is a policy that says some portion of the contract should be set aside for women-owned business in the state and minority business. And for example, in South Africa, after the apartheid, public procurement was used, to enhance the competitiveness of the black community. And also addressing discrimination against people with disability. And this is before the Rio de Janeiro Conference of Sustainable Development. I mean, this is after the war in England, where the government says some of the soldiers that fought in the war that lost, their hands or legs should not be discriminated against. And public procurement is used as that. So the list is endless of how public procurement has been used to address social issues. We also have example in Malaysia where 30% of the contract is reserved for Bomepetra contractors, which are indigenous contractors. If you move down to Canada, you have a procurement strategy for Aboriginal business, which are indigenous business. I mean, it's all over the places. In Belgium, the government says that it will not approve grant above 30 million Belgian currency if there is no evidence that that contractor is going to generate new employment. So these are part of the ways that social responsible procurement has been deployed. Now, moving straight to my study, and sorry to bore you with those background evidence of what social procurement is all about. Public procurement in Nigeria is relatively new. It's still growing. But then that does not mean that there is no public procurement before the introduction of the Public Procurement Act. Nigeria was colonized by Britain, and in the pre-independent era, that is before Nigeria gained independence, public procurement was guided by the British administrative process. But then shortly before the independence, Nigeria gained independence in 1960. Shortly before 1960, the Nigerian government adopted the Financial Management Control Act, which guides, financial management and tender regulation. So the Minister of Finance leveraged on that act to look at tenders and some other things. Now, Nigeria moved into democracy, full democracy, in 1999, which has been sustained till today. And the president that, was sworn in thought there is a need for us to transform the existing procurement landscape of the country and invited World Bank to conduct an assessment. And one of the outcomes, one of the recommendations of that assessment is that a public procurement law should be established. And that is what led to the Nigerian Public Procurement Act 2007. So that's why I said it's still relatively new. However, I felt that the recommendation in that report that World Bank did should reflect some social priorities. And why I felt so is Nigeria is a developing country, though Nigeria has a lot of potentials with respect to economic, income, crude oil, but then the social performance has been something else. So I decided to look at what are the social-oriented factors. I said social-oriented because there is no social procurement policy in place in the country. So there is no specific policy that is developed by government for a specific social aim in the country. And that is why I said social-oriented. So my intention is to look into the existing document and data and see if there are social-oriented factors that are considered in public procurement in Nigeria. And I want to see, what these social-oriented factors, where do they come from? Do they come from the public procurement law? Do they come from the suppliers? Do they come from public procurement officers? That's my aim. And the result question is, what social factors are being promoted through public procurement in Nigeria? So to generate, the justification of that, which I've discussed, is Nigeria has a high potential with respect to generation of income, but then majority of what the government spends does not impact on the society. And research have shown that there are perceived gender disparity in the country. The youth employment and poverty is rising. These are critical issues that I think if public procurement would be used to address, it makes sense. So, what is the methodology? I tried as much as possible to source for tenders. And good for me, I was able to find 2 websites that publishes tenders in Nigeria. One of the websites is dedicated website by the Public Procurement, the Bureau for Public Procurement in Nigeria, to publish all tenders. And that was accessible, to the public. So I try as much as possible to download tenders between October 2011 and 2012. This is an exploratory study. And I picked 62 tenders. And how did I arrive at 62? I started looking at one tender, trying to identify, what factors, what criteria are used in evaluating tenders that are social-oriented. And when I got to 62, I realized that there is nothing new that I'm saying. All the social-oriented factors have been exhausted, and I stopped the analysis. So then after that, I moved to, developing such findings into a short questionnaire to seek the view of public procurement officers as per which of these factors do you think is more important to drive social responsible behavior of suppliers. So it's not enough for us to have all these factors in the tender document, but are they critical? Are they relevant? Would they impact the supply chain? And that's what led to the second investigation. Now, my results. First and foremost, I was able to find out that the majority of the tenders that I analyzed fell into construction, which makes a lot of sense because a lot of construction projects are on the ground, then followed by supplies, but we have little project services contract. Now, in analyzing the data that I get, I try to categorize those criteria and look at the social value that those criteria try to promote. So that's how I arrive at this category. So these are sentences from these findings. These are the criteria that I found in the tender. And first and foremost, I realized that one of the fundamental requirements of the tenders, or of the expression of interest document, is that bidders should provide evidence of contribution to the Industrial Training Fund. The Industrial Training Fund is established by the government, and the idea is to enhance capacity and skill in the country. And how this works is every private organization is supposed to contribute 1% of the payroll of individual employee to this fund. So if that private sector organization decides to conduct training, relevant training, for their employees afterwards, then they will be refunded by the government. So they make an application with evidence that we've trained so person, and we need a refund, and the government will pay them back. Okay, so I felt asking bidders to provide this at the shortlisting stage, not contract award, at the PQQ stage, is very, very critical. However, like I was discussing this afternoon, there are a lot of issues with reimbursement, claiming, for private sector to actually claim this money back. A lot of people have contributed, they've trained their staff, and they made application to the government, and the money was not paid. But that's outside the scope of my research. Another thing that I find out is there is also request for suppliers to give evidence that they have contributed to the contributory pension scheme of the government, and also evidence that they have also contributed to the employee compensation scheme. So all this is just to trigger some responsible practices within the supply chain of the public sector to make sure that every contractor or potential contractor who wants to win business with the government will have it at the back of their mind that they have to do this. And these have direct impact on their employee. Now, very, very interesting. There are instances where the tenders request, the expression of interest request as minimum criteria that the bidder should provide evidence of job creation in the local community and give, the numbers of jobs that they want to create. So, now moving into the result as well, I find out that those criteria, those social factors that are frequently used were actually driven by the public procurement requirement. Because I went back to the Public Procurement Act of Nigeria, there is a section there that says that tax payment, compliance with, training fund, compliance with compensation scheme should be a minimum requirement. So I find out that a larger chunk of this are requested by law. However, those that are not requested by law, which is promotion of jobs and employment, were independently introduced by the public sector officers, either procurement officers or whosoever that was designing that specification. So it shows that some came from the public procurement regulation and the others come from, the public procurement officers. Now, what I did, like I said in my methodology, is to now go back to the public procurement officers and ask them to rate these factors. What I'm trying to do is to see if what the public procurement officer perceive is important social factor is the same thing that the government is considering. And surprisingly, I find out that the public procurement officers plan to engage in community and assurance of employing graduates as more important social factors than those social factors that actually exist in the Public Procurement Act. Okay? The only social-oriented factor that they chose as critical is evidence of tax clearance certificate. Every other social factors that exist in the Public Procurement Act were not perceived critical by the public procurement officers. So what does that tell us? It tells us that there are some social-oriented factors that are driven, by public procurement in Nigeria, and these factors, originate either from the public procurement law and also from either public procurement officer or civil servant who felt that it is needed for us to include this. And like I said, I've discussed that the most widely used social-oriented factors originate from the law. And however, those social factors that are not contained in the law, that has to do with job creation and community development, were tenders that were advertised in the Niger Delta region. And I realized that the Niger Delta region is where the Nigerian oil-producing communities, exist. So I find out that maybe the public procurement officers or the public sector or civil servant that developed the specification felt we need to develop, a capacity of local people. We need to create jobs through this tender so that we don't have crisis, So in conclusion, based on the nature of these findings, we cannot say that the current use of social-oriented criteria is a milestone in implementing social responsible procurement in Nigeria. Because like I said, there is no policy that says that Nigeria has a social responsible procurement objective. There is no clear policy. So I can't say it's a milestone. However, the only logical conclusion that I can make from this research is public procurement is used to drive some social policies of the government. And we see this in South Africa, where some social policies of the government were integrated into the public procurement process for consideration. So, but then there is scope really for using public procurement to channel the government to improve government objective in Nigeria. And I arrive at implications for future government policy, which includes the fact that the spending power of the government all over the world, not only in Nigeria, is huge. And this could be an opportunity to stimulate the local economy, address issues like gender equity and SMEs development. Now, if Nigeria is interested really to develop a clear social public procurement policy, then I suggest, based on this finding, that good stakeholders consultation has to be initiated, because my findings show that what was in the Act is perceived not as important by the public procurement officer. So I think there is a kind of disconnect. So I recommend that such collaboration has to be made. And also, I also want you to know that why this research, create some fundamental data that other researchers could build upon for future investigation, it has a limitation. You will agree with me that 62 expression of interest is actually limited to make reasonable and dependable conclusion. And that means that there are opportunities for other researchers to improve on this and to leverage on this data to investigate how social factors have been integrated into public procurement in Nigeria. Thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen, for listening.